Hi, Scott.
Hello.
Hi.
Sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened, but hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this professional learning opportunity. I am Scott Mathias from NCEA, and I will be your host today. Today's webinar, Grammar Instruction That Makes a Difference, is being led by Ellen Edmonds, Vice President of Learning for Sadler School. Once a teacher, intervention specialist, and administrator in Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools, she has since provided leadership in reading and mathematics instruction and intervention, fidelity of implementation of curricula, implementation of assessment systems, educational technology implementation, professional development, and early childhood education. We will be saving some time at the end for questions. If you want to go ahead and enter questions as you think about them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom window, and we will answer those after Ellen's presentation. Before I turn it over to Ellen, let us begin, as we always do, in prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Father, we ask for your guidance during these times and for your wisdom to be imparted to each of us as we listen to the information being presented today. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Ellen, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for the opportunity to be with everyone. I'm really excited to talk with you about something that matters a great deal, and I think sometimes we don't really realize how much it makes a difference. So we're going to be talking about grammar instruction that makes a difference. I look forward to a conversation with you, so please put your questions and your comments in the chat as we go along. I want to talk about a number of different things. I want to talk about what I mean when I say makes a difference. And then I want to talk with you about what instruction looks like when it makes a difference and provide some concrete examples around that, and then save time at the end for more of a conversation with you. As I think about grammar instruction, I have to tell you that I think about my experience growing up. I am a child of educators. My grandmothers were educators. My great-great-grandmother was an educator. And grammar instruction was really an instrumental part of their instruction. And I think we've all either had the presence of or absence of grammar instruction in our past. So I'd like for you to take just a moment and reflect on your own experience, both as a student and as a teacher with grammar instruction. And I want you to keep that thought in mind, what that experience was like as we move forward with this discussion. I want to start by talking just a little bit about the history of grammar instruction when the United States was really being formed, even before we were united. In 1740 and forward, there were textbooks used in classrooms that focused on grammar instruction. And that grammar instruction was largely what we now call drill and kill. Lots of practice, lots of rules. And over time, that grammar instruction included diagramming sentences. Interestingly, research was done to determine whether grammar instruction was effective. And it was determined that grammar instruction didn't make a difference for students. So for a very long period of time, in many classrooms, grammar instruction was absent. Then there began to be some research done, first with looking at English learners and then all students, and the recognition that previous grammar instruction research really focused on bad practices and therefore resulted in poor outcomes. And so research was designed to look at what was believed to be better practices in terms of grammar instruction and the results were that there was a significant impact on students' development. So we've seen a resurgence in terms of grammar being incorporated into standards that we use, and a really new reflection in terms of the importance of grammar instruction. And it's in that context that I'd like to talk with you about what grammar can do for our students. I think it's important to think about the impact that grammar instruction can have and how we are really called upon to incorporate grammar instruction so that we can make a difference for the students in our classroom, both in the short term and in the long term. We know from that body of evidence that grammar instruction that is properly done results in students writing more effectively. Now, I want to be clear, that's not grammar instruction absent writing instruction, but grammar instruction married to writing instruction results in students more effectively writing. And grammar instruction results in significant increases in reading comprehension. Grammar instruction improves all aspects of communication, even our oral communication. And grammar instruction results in students being more likely to be successful in a university setting, being more likely to be hired and retained in the work world. So it really contributes to post-secondary success. And grammar instruction, when relevant, relatable, and meaningful, has a greater impact for students. So let's look quickly at each of these. In terms of the impact on writing, there are certain instructional strategies that have a more positive influence on students' writing development. Sentence combining, sentence expansion, sentence imitation make a very big difference in students' writing. And when we are teaching grammar and providing application opportunities in the context of writing, we see that impact really grow in terms of students' writing development. It makes sense if we understand how to organize our words, if we understand how to make what we write more engaging, if we understand how to be clear in what we say, then those individuals who read what we write will understand also. And that's the essential outcome that we're looking for. Be more engaged, be more likely to read what we write in the future. So grammar has that impact on students' writing. It has a really significant impact on students' reading, particularly as they move up the grade levels. And it certainly makes sense. As students move up the grade levels, the texts that they read move from having short sentences to having much more complex language, not just in terms of vocabulary, but in terms of the structure of sentences. And if students understand clauses, if they understand how nouns and verbs work, subjects and predicates work, they're much more likely to be able to comprehend what they read. And in fact, understanding the structure of our language makes us more fluent as readers, freeing up our working memory to really focus on understanding the text that we read. So that is part of the reason we now talk about text complexity and look at the influence of the structure of the sentences on students' understanding of the text, making meaning of the text that they read. It is interesting to note how important grammar is in terms of our oral communication. I think in a world where we do a lot of texting, we do a lot of very abbreviated communication that largely disregards what we know about the conventions of standard English, we forget how important it is for us to understand the structure of our language. And as we communicate, whether by phone or students listening to us as classroom educators or talking with our colleagues, if we understand language structure, we're more able to process the information that's provided. We're also able to connect what we learn through being readers with prosody, that certain intonations are also telling us about the structure of the sentences, and that further assists us in understanding what's being told to us. So across the board, our reading, our writing, our speaking, and our listening are improved when we use the conventions of standard English. And of course, those are all tightly related to academic success. So clearly, grammar has an impact that should draw our attention as classroom educators. But we're not just concerned about students' success in our classrooms. We want students to have the opportunity to be successful in post-secondary education. We want students to, if they're inclined to do so, be able to be successful at the university setting. And unfortunately, a very high percentage of students who enter the university setting have to get additional support through writing centers. They're not really prepared to be successful in that university setting. And it's even the case that students who are in master's programs are referred to writing centers. The state of Colorado did quite a bit of studying of this with ACT and found that it was something that needed our attention. And we as educators understand that in a university setting, whether it's community college or other, you need to be able to communicate effectively. You need to be able to understand what you read. You need to be able to write effectively. And so grammar becomes instrumental in that setting. It is also true that our use of the conventions of standard English, our correct use of the conventions of standard English, has an influence on our success in the working world. Grammarly, along with Forbes and LinkedIn, have done quite a bit of analysis to determine that impact. And it's the case that you're more likely to be hired if you use the conventions of standard English correctly. You're more likely to be retained. You're more likely to be promoted. It truly matters in the working world. And I think sometimes we mislead ourselves because we do have software that supports us in using correct grammar. Unfortunately, there are many times we communicate when we don't have access to that. And that's where the significant impact is found. But it's also true that we're not always consistent about using those resources, our spell check and our grammar checks, as we're using written communication. So the impact is across the years. And we know that we need to think about making a difference for our students by attending to grammar instruction. So what should we be doing? Well, one thing that we need to do is make sure that the grammar instruction that we provide has a sound research basis. We know what works and what doesn't work in terms of effective grammar instruction. These are 5 of the most essential elements of effective grammar instruction. Constraints of time and probably your interest preclude more conversation around this, but I want to be very clear that when we teach grammar, we're not talking about just providing lots of exposure to written text and to good examples of writing and expecting that implicitly students are going to understand what they should take away from that in terms of use of the conventions of standard English. Instead, we need to directly and explicitly teach what we want students to learn. When we do that, then we see a greater impact in terms of student success. So we need to, whether we use a program or use other resources, directly and explicitly teach the expectations, the standards that we have in place at each grade level, and other general understandings of the conventions of standard English. And we need to make sure that that explicit instruction is married to that extensive reading and writing that supports grammar acquisition. We want students to have that opportunity. When we think about what an effective direct instruction model is, because many of us may have poor examples in our past experience, we need to pause and really understand what that means. So really effective grammar instruction begins with a mini lesson where we teach a grammar concept and then provides opportunity for students to practice that in a very focused and targeted way, followed by situating that practice further and that application in the context of reading and writing. So we start with a mini lesson, we provide that practice, and then we connect those targeted lessons to meaningful opportunities to write and to texts that provide ample examples of the particular concept or skill that we've taught. We want to use all the resources at our fingertips to provide that research-based effective grammar instruction. But if we want grammar instruction to really make a difference for our students, we need to keep in mind three critical aspects of our instruction. Our instruction needs to be relevant. It, for students, needs to be connected to their learning process. They need to have some autonomy in taking advantage of what's provided. They need to be able to see how it connects to what they're doing in the reading and writing in not only our English language arts classrooms, but our other classrooms also. And we need to make it something that is relatable for students. Certainly choice is a part of that. We need to make sure that there are ways that this learning is connected to something that is of interest to students, that they see its importance in a lot of different ways. And so we need to think about how we can make it meaningful to them, what gives them some excitement in terms of the learning process. And we need to make sure that students understand how learning this has an impact on their daily lives. Teaching grammar and abstraction when they don't see the connection to what they're doing means that it's something they're going to ignore. I mentioned earlier that a lot of the way that we communicate is through texting, and very few people text the way I do in full sentences and paragraphs. So students need to see why grammar instruction matters. They need to make the connection to the working world or their plans for post-secondary education to be able to communicate appropriately and be understood with their peers, not just in texting, but in general. And so we have to continually make sure that they see that meaningful connection to their daily operations. So we have to integrate what we're doing with grammar instruction with our other instruction in English language arts. And we have to connect it to what students are doing on a daily basis. And there are lots of different ways to do that. Certainly connecting it to reading and writing, providing application and situating in the context of reading and writing is really important for our students so that they're seeing what they're learning and seeing how it influences what they take away from a piece of text or what others take away from a piece of text. So as we're teaching students the writing process and types of writing, we want to make sure that we're zeroing in on what we're teaching in grammar, and not in an overwhelming way. Sometimes it's tempting to use our red pens and correct everything that students write. But if we've just been focusing on complete sentences, then that should be the focus of our feedback as students are writing. And we should make the connection to whatever they're reading and writing in class. We need to think about the types of writing that students are doing and think about which elements of grammar instruction are most relevant to that type of writing and connect the two so that as students are engaged in the project work that they're doing in our class and the writing that they're doing in our class, they will be able to practice what they're learning and make those connections. And again, choice needs to be a part of this, making it relevant to students and relatable is really important as we think about those particular application opportunities for our students. I think it does take planning. It cannot just be something that happens incidentally. We need to think about the text that we're reading and make sure that the grammar lesson that we are teaching has a high frequency of instances of whatever particular concept or skill we're teaching, so that students can easily see it in use. A couple of examples are not sufficient to support students, and not enough exposures to really make a difference for them. So again, all of this is done in the context of your standards-based instruction, the content that you're already teaching. I'm not suggesting that you go in search of new content, new books, new writing opportunities for students. I'm really suggesting that you be more intentional in using what's already in place so that your students are meeting grade level expectations. It is something that brings great joy to me to be able to do, and I think you'll find that it really makes a difference in your grammar instruction. I see students in classrooms where this is happening really excited about learning grammar and not behaving as though the experience is a deadly experience. So let's walk through some examples. I would like to share a couple of examples across the grade level. So beginning with an elementary classroom where you're reading Because of Winn-Dixie, and connecting that to the study that you're doing around quotations, helping students understand the use of quotations in dialogue, helping them understand when a quotation comes at the end of a sentence, what the punctuation is like, making sure that they understand all the various aspects, the use of quotation marks, and when we don't use quotation marks. So clearly this is a piece of text that provides ample exposure to quotations across a few pages of a chapter, so that students can see examples of each of the types of instances that would be covered in your lesson. And there could be the further discussion beyond what was provided in the lesson. Those exposures and that integrating of it would be very important. And then as students write in response to that piece of text, having them use dialogue and having them use quotations would be equally important. When we think about Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, probably something that would be taught in middle school, it's a good opportunity to talk about compound sentences and series and the use of commas, using commas in direct address or introductory phrases or non-essential clauses or direct quotations, so that students see examples of those. And in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, there are ample examples of the use of commas and a great opportunity. Thinking in moving into probably high school, I have several high school examples, partly because I think it's more complex for teachers in high school to take the time to think about these connections. I think that often in middle school, there are more opportunities for this because of the length of the class period and because of the nature of the resources we're using. And similarly in elementary school, where often students are not just reading trade books, but reading short stories and other pieces of text that lend themselves to this kind of integration, and a lot more writing work that is supported by teachers are done at those levels. So if we think about 1984, a high school opportunity to look at quotation marks similar to what we did in middle school, and to think about how we punctuate dialogue. Lots and lots of opportunities for that across the text, so that students get that exposure, and then as they write, have the opportunity to use that learning themselves. Or with Animal Farm, think about all of the types of nouns that are in Animal Farm. proper nouns, abstract nouns, collective nouns, compound nouns, as you look across the text. So lots of opportunities again, and I'm not circling each of those, just a few examples so that you get the gist of what I'm talking about with students. And then as we think about something like To Kill a Mockingbird, I think there's so much here that supports us in that sort of integration. Just by its very nature, To Kill a Mockingbird gives us rich opportunity to look at language, to look at the use of grammar. There's some opportunities that are really obvious. And certainly if you look at the way Harper Lee writes, she really is very careful in layering her language so that there is sort of a secondary meaning. So she's very careful about the way that she uses words and she uses punctuation to communicate that. If you think about, for instance, Scout and Scout's maturity as it increases or as she grows older across the novel, you see a difference in her language, but also a difference in her language versus Chim's language and her growing understanding of not taking advantage of that difference in language capabilities and what that means in terms of their communication. So there are so many rich opportunities to talk about this with students as they're reading and to point this out and to point out how authors use language to communicate with us, to send messages. It's truly a craft, and to really make that very obvious and explicit for students. When I think about an easy connection for grammar instruction, proper nouns and proper adjectives, they're used across the novel. And so you can see examples of all of those as a student would be reading, and quite easy to call those to students' attention and have discussions about those. So across the year, it isn't that we would expect that you would do this with every piece of text that students would read, or that you would do it with every writing opportunity. But the more that you can integrate your grammar instruction with the reading and writing work done in your classroom, the greater the value for students, the more likely they are to retain what they've learned, and the impact will certainly be increased. So maybe you start out by having something happen like this, be planned like this once a quarter, and then you increase the integration across the year as you get more comfortable with it. It certainly is important, as I mentioned, to focus on the standards, to focus on the major work of the grade level as you're doing this integration, because that's where you want to see the biggest impact. It's where you want to make the biggest difference for students. So you have to think about all of those elements that I talked about that are important, your research-based best practices, and you also have to think about keeping students engaged, making it relevant, relatable, and meaningful for them. I think that there's a standard routine that's really effective, particularly with the connections to literature and to writing. And I'd like to talk about this 6-step routine with you and to provide an example that has most of these elements, and then an example that's a little bit different, that doesn't have every one of the elements, but has most of these steps of the routine in place as a way to share with you what might work in your classroom. So when we think about showing students examples of the grammatical concepts used in literature, we really want to make sure that we start out with that mini lesson and the targeted application. But then we really want students to see how that is relevant for them. So how an author uses that concept. And we want to try to pick high interest pieces of literature as part of that work for students, because of course that increases their understanding of the usefulness of what they are learning. And we have to be very explicit in helping students understand how the use of that concept, how that tool that an author used increases the impact of what that author's writing does or has on us. We want them to see why the author employed that particular tool. So that has to be an explicit part of the conversation. And we have to really make sure that as we're working with our students, we analyze text and we talk about those choices that authors make and why they make those choices. And part of the way we make that very clear to students is to look at that piece of text without those particular tools or concepts in play, making it very evident what it feels like and how we perceive of it absent those particular concepts. In well-written pieces of text, the authors use the structure of the text as part of the way that they communicate to us. And we want that to be very evident to students because we want them to use that same approach. We want them to see that their voice is more effective when they use what they understand about our language as part of the way that they communicate it. It's not just relying on the words, it's relying on the way the words are put together, and that becomes quite powerful for our students. So that analysis, that explicit discussion is really critical. We have to talk about what we think the author was thinking. We have to make that metacognitive process that writers go through evident to our students. And so it requires a conversation, it requires instructional opportunities that support that. And we have to make sure that we not only teach this and talk about this, but then in turn, we ask students to incorporate what they're learning in their own writing. And that we provide feedback to them explicitly on that, focusing on that, zeroing in on that, and not other aspects of their particular writing. They'll see a difference and it will be perceived by their colleagues as well. And that is a part of what really converts your students. And so that application to their own work is an important part of the process. We want them consistently using what we've modeled through our instruction, what they've seen in someone else's work. That application to their own work is really important. So we want to really think about each of these steps and the importance of laying out what we do so that that experience is provided for students and that they're thinking about their writing. They're thinking about the words they choose. They're thinking about the way that they structure their sentences. They're thinking about their use of various parts of speech. Whatever it is that we're focusing on, we want students to be really cognizant of and intentional in their use of it. So as I think about the work that we do with students, I think that this kind of effort makes a difference at every grade level. It makes a difference for each of us, but it also requires some planning on the part of a teacher. I think that that's why I'm suggesting that these more extended efforts are things that you maybe do once a quarter, that you really use to make sure that students master the expectations of the grade level. So it might be that your grade level focuses on particular types of phrases and clauses. That is a focus at the high school level. It's a focus at every level, but it's explicitly a part of standards in high school. And so if you're thinking about the use of phrases and the use of clauses and the distinction between the two, to communicate, to convey meaning, what pieces of text are students exposed to that would provide the kind of experience with the use of phrases and clauses that would make a difference for them, would help them understand. I thought about this and thought about some pieces of text that I typically see read at the high school level. And we read a lot of Shakespeare in high school. So I started thinking about connecting the grammar lessons on clauses and phrases to a piece of work, Shakespeare's work. And I thought about Romeo and Juliet. I thought particularly about the prologue, and I thought about the lessons that would be relevant to working with Romeo and Juliet, looking at independent clauses and subordinate clauses and adjective clauses and adverb clauses and noun clauses, and then being able to think about the structure of sentences and understanding compound and complex and compound complex sentences, and being able to, because of the structure of that sentence, as you're reading it, make meaning out of it. And in Shakespeare's work, he doesn't follow common day, current day use of clauses. There's a very archaic approach to it, which means that we have to be much more cognizant of the use of clauses and phrases and our language. So thinking about it, as I said, I thought the prologue would be a good starting place. So students would need a copy of the prologue. I want this to be a hands-on exercise for students. So I thought about the materials that would be necessary. My learning objective would be that students would be able to analyze Shakespeare's use of syntactical elements and its contribution to tone. And so I want students identifying sentence breaks with slash marks and phrases in one color and clauses in another. And I want them to talk with their colleagues about the difference between a clause and a phrase. And I want them to do this work collaboratively. And so there's a process for doing that I outlined, where they work with partners. One of the things that makes a learning experience for students particularly meaningful is when they're working with peers. Collaboration is of high value to the majority of students, and certainly for adolescents, a critical element. So I want to incorporate partner work as much as I can as an option. So students would work on this together, going through each of the steps that I outlined. They would take the sentence strips that they were using from the prologue. They would get rid of the unnecessary words. They would revise the construction, and they would share that with each other, perhaps share it with a smaller team, and then talk with each other about which construction had greater impact on them as a reader. Absent those phrases, absent those clauses, simple sentences, or the more complex structure that Shakespeare uses. So this is just an example of an original construction in Shakespeare and a revised construction. There are many other examples that could be provided, but that discussion is really important for students. They start to see author's craft. They start to see how syntax makes a difference. And that's the experience we want students to have, certainly using what they're learning about the clauses and phrases. They need to understand the impact on tone. And so that is one example. I thought of another example that I wanted to share with you. And we read different texts at different levels. So I just wanted to point out that this work could be done at 9th grade. It could be done at 11th grade. One of the things about grammar instruction is that we teach generally the same concepts across the years because language sophistication increases. There may be particular aspects or concepts that are emphasized in our standards, and of course they get greater attention, but generally we're working across the levels focused on constructing effective sentences, effective paragraphs, understanding parts of speech, And that sort of approach is going to be something we can draw upon whatever grade level we're teaching. I thought about Into the Wild and thought about how that might be used for this continued work, both giving students the opportunity as they're reading to think about the structure of language, and then giving them the opportunity to examine that as they're doing writing work. And so I thought of a couple of project options. One of the options I thought about was looking at Into the Wild and thinking about the fact that we generally characterize this as a journalistic work, and using what we consider elements of journalistic work as a frame for comparing Into the Wild to determine if it is indeed a work of journalism, but really evaluate it in that way. One of the things that students will start to focus on is that in journalism, sentences are short, very direct, so they need to be analyzing sentence structure as they're doing this analysis. And I would give students the opportunity to work independently or with a partner to select the chapter or chapters that they would like to use, to select from 3 different characterizations of effective journalism, to choose the one that they prefer to do the analysis, and then to choose their own format for sharing that work that they've done. Some may choose to do a table, some may choose to provide a written analysis. All students would have to do a 1-page summary analysis. All students would have to present their findings. They could go live or they could record a video. I would provide rubrics so that students would be able to analyze their own work and see if they're meeting the requirements. Another option would be to think about some of the themes that are really addressed in Into the Wild. One of the themes is the theme of alienation, and choose another text that had been read. So if you think about alienation and a typical text that's also read in high school, Catcher in the Rye, students might do an analysis with those 2 pieces of text, or they could choose another theme like individual and society and use The Giver or Siddhartha, or they might use another theme, man versus nature, and use Walden or The Call of the Wild. So let students have choice in terms of the theme and the piece of text that they were going to do the analysis with, and then really compare the writing styles of the 2 authors, and write about the use of the writing styles and provide specific evidence, citations, examples of those sentences and elements. And if they want to get extra credit, do a multimedia presentation detailing their findings. I could give you many more examples, and I recognize that these are just barely developed plans, but I want to give you a sense of how you might begin to think about your own classrooms, the reading and writing happening in your classrooms, to shift your grammar instruction to make a difference for your students. And so as we think about that grammar instruction that makes a difference, I just want to remind you, it needs to be research-based. So standards aligned, mini lessons, focused practice, application that contextualizes it in reading and writing, relatable, relevant, and meaningful to our students. We can improve students' writing. We can increase their reading comprehension. We can change their communication so that they are both orally and in writing better able to say what they mean, to be heard, to understand what others say. We can open the door for more success in a university or college setting and more success in the working world. I think all of us as educators would like to accomplish those ends for our students. And so I certainly hope that you can think about shifting your grammar instruction to make that kind of difference. Thank you for taking the time to be with me. I'm hoping we have a couple of questions. So let me check the chat. Scott, do you have anything that you would like to add?
No, I get at this point, if anyone has questions for Ellen, you can go ahead and put them in the Q&A window at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And we'll see. I was curious myself about with students being so tied to their cell phones nowadays, that must have such an effect on how grammar is approached in a learning situation, because they're using shorthand,
Exactly.
to communicate with each other. And how do you emphasize having or imparting a strong grammar course when that's the kind of communication that they're used to, among their peers and with their parents, maybe even.
I think we have to make sure that they understand that that's a narrow slice of the kinds of communication that we do in the real world, and start to expose them to the variety of ways that we're called upon as we collaborate. So as they think about the projects that they work on together in class, that's just a window into the way the working world works now. And in the working world, we do a lot of oral communication, and we need to be able to understand each other. And we don't speak in the shorthand way that we do as we text. It's interesting, if you share a series of texts with students and ask them if they would be interested in reading that, they are very clear in saying, no, that's terribly boring. But they have to do sustained reading of that. So you really do have to start to expose them to life beyond the classroom, which, is important as we think about middle and high school students. It's just beginning to be an issue in 4th and 5th grade, but those students are much more inclined to engage in repartee in the classroom and with each other, and they're not so heavily influenced by texting. But it certainly has made a difference in terms of all of our use of the conventions of standard English, and it's important to consider. We had one participant who noted the importance of practice, and that certainly is something that we have to keep in mind with all learning. It takes lots of experience, lots of exposures, and lots of practice to really master what we're learning. I think that for a long time we didn't understand that. So whether it's early grades and learning to read and phonics work, or mathematics or grammar, we need lots of exposures and lots of practice. We had someone ask if I strongly recommended a curriculum. And I obviously work for Sadlier. And so I would be remiss if I didn't note that we have a highly effective series, Grammar Workshop, Tools for Writing, and Grammar for Writing, written by Beverly Chin, someone who's an expert in the field of education and an expert in effective grammar instruction and writing. So I certainly would recommend Grammar Workshop, Tools for Writing, and Grammar for Writing. I hesitate in terms of recommending anything else because I don't, it's been quite a while since I've been in the classroom. My children are no longer in the classroom, and so I'm not intimately familiar with other resources. But I think you would want to look at any grammar program, make sure that many lessons are a component, because the research shows that that's critical. Make sure that there's focused practice, and make sure that there's support for applying what they're learning to writing. So whatever program or curriculum you're evaluating, those elements are essential, and then align to your standards so that they support the teaching that you're expected to provide.
Yeah, I noticed that this was specifically a question for K through 2, and the Sadlier have the line of materials that are starting from kindergarten through 12th grade, or?
That's a great, I didn't note that. Thank you for asking me to read more carefully. So when we think about grammar instruction in kindergarten, first and second grade, students are developing as readers and writers. And so generally speaking, what we do is integrate that grammar work within a curriculum that is providing support for development in all of those areas. As we move into third grade, students are generally fluently reading and writing, and that's where the more focused grammar instruction comes into play, which is part of why Sadlier provides curricula that begins in third grade, where students are generally fluent readers and writers. But we certainly have resources to support students' acquisition of the conventions of standard English and grammar concepts and skills beginning in kindergarten, first and second grade, integrated within our English language arts materials. And as I mentioned, I'm not in the classroom, I'm not an administrator anymore, and I'm not looking at other curricula to be able to make suggestions beyond that. But again, those same elements are important, more so in the early years, kindergarten, first and second. We're doing a lot of modeling. We're having a lot of oral conversations. All of that supports students, that rich language exposure, so that when they have more intentional grammar instruction in third grade and beyond, it will be in that sea of talk and writing that is critical to being able to master those skills.
Well, if there are no other questions, I wanted to thank you, Ellen, first, and also our participants today, our attendees, and wanted to let you know that I will be sending out a survey after this session, and also I will send the recording to everyone who registered for this webinar. I guess if you have anything else, Ellen, that you wanted to note at the end, or?
No, thank you very much for having this opportunity for us. Sadlier really values our NCEA partnership, and we look forward to continuing to work together. We look forward to the spring and being together through the conference. We have a lot of opportunities there to connect with presentations, so we hope that you'll join us then.
Yes, and thank you for mentioning our conference, which will be in person in New Orleans, April 19th through the 21st. And if you want to find out more information about that, it's at nca.org/NCA2022. Thanks again, and we'll look forward to seeing you at our next webinar.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Okay, bye-bye.